everyone, welcome to this TollPuzzle webinar on Building Back Better. For those of you who are hoping to be at TollPuzzle, think of this as your virtual Masters Marquee for the next hour or so. And we're going to be debating what I think is one of the key issues of the time. My name's Sue Ferns, I'm the TUC General Counsel Lead on Environment and Sustainability. We've got a great panel of speakers this afternoon who I will introduce in a moment. Let me first of all go through some operational issues. Hopefully lots of you will have used Zoom before. For most of you, you'll find at the bottom of your screen a chat box and a Q&A box. If you joined on iPad, that might be in a different place on your screen. Just to let you know, please feel free to use the chat function, and the code of conduct for the festival will be posted in the chat function. But just to say that we will be taking Q&A through the Q&A box. So don't assume that you can put something in chat and it will be picked up. If you want an answer to it, please do use the Q&A box and not the chat box. I should say that this session is being recorded. It's also been live streamed on Facebook, so we'll be able to include any questions that come from Facebook viewers, and it is also on YouTube. Let me first of all introduce our speakers. Firstly, we have Darren Jones, MP, who is chair of the BEIS Select Committee. Secondly, we'll hear from Miatta van Bullen, who's the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation. Then from Joanne Nisbet, who is director of Gap Square. And then last but not least, from Wes Streeting, MP for Ilford North. I'll give a little bit more background to each of the speakers as we come to them. They're all going to speak to you for about 5 minutes, and then that should give us plenty of time for Q&A when you've heard from them all. So with no further ado, let me introduce Darren Jones, MP, Chair of the BEIS Select Committee, MP for Bristol North West. Darren is also a member of the Joint Committee on National Security and the Parliamentary Liaison Committee, which scrutinises the work of the Prime Minister. Darren, over to you. Let's hear your take on Building Back Better.
Well, thank you, Sue, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone at TollPuzzle for the invitation to be with you once again. I'm as gutted as the rest of you, I'm sure, that we're not sat in a sunny field in Dorset, but hats off to the team for turning it around so quickly into this multi-platform technology event and keeping the conversation going. So the topic today for Build Back Better is really important, because we do have this kind of once in a generation opportunity to build back better. But the question is, what does that mean? And my fear, my concern is that, we have a prime minister that stands up and just kind of splurts out words and says, build, build, build. And he thinks that's the end. But it's not. And there's a really important job for us in opposition, people like Wes on the front bench, with our other panelists in the economy and in the lobbying work that we do in the trade union movement and the Labour Party more generally, to hold the Tories and the government to account on this issue, because they can't squander this opportunity to build back better. So I'll just run through a few points about what I think that means, and why I think we've got such an important job to do in the Labour and the trade union movement. The first is being sophisticated about the recovery of our economy. And for all of the kind of Instagram posts from Rishi Sunak, I'm not entirely convinced he's got a very sophisticated approach to understanding the economy and what we need to do to build back better. And one key example of that, and I say this as an MP for North Bristol, is sectoral support in the manufacturing sector. The mind boggles that the government hasn't brought forward sectoral support for manufacturing like other countries like France or Germany and the United States have, whether it's in aerospace or automotive or steel. They're just not bringing forward the jobs. And I've raised this with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Business Secretary. And I said, what is it that you've got against British workers building British airplanes, British cars and British steel? And they just don't have an answer. And I think this goes to the heart of what the Tories think about a fiscal stimulus. And I wrote a few weeks ago in the papers that we need a fiscal stimulus in people as well as a fiscal stimulus in infrastructure. It's all well and good building a new trade station or a road, and that will help in certain circumstances. But unless we invest in British workers and the British people, we're not going to make the best of the recovery of our economy, because we're not going to be able to bring together the contributions that everybody can make across the length and breadth of our country. And there are some classic examples of that. The Conservatives have talked a little bit about jobs for younger people, some things around apprenticeships, not enough in my view. But what they fail to recognise, especially in sectors like manufacturing, is that it takes a long time to know how to do your trade. You've got to be trained and mentored in this. You can't kind of sack or make redundant the 50-year-old that knows how to do this specialist jobs and bring in an apprentice and hope they're going to learn how to do it. So why are we not, as a state, supporting the retention of our skilled workers who know what they're doing, who can train the next generation, work on the research and development and the innovation, and put together that collective effort in the run-up to their sectors being able to get back on their feet? It's just not acceptable. And again, it goes to the heart of the Tories not really understanding how best to work with people in the British economy. And this training in the workplace is also vital, and the trade unions have a vital role in helping to deliver this. There, of course, is going to be some restructuring the economy as a consequence of the pandemic, but we should be putting stabilizers on that and helping workers transition. And the best place to help workers transition is in the workplace, by delivering training and skills in the workplace, not allowing people to lose their jobs and have to be at home on universal credit and then thinking about how you deliver it. So again, we should be funding training as part of transition as well as retention in the workplace. And the second piece is that the government keeps talking about levelling up. And of course, we support that. We want every part of the country, whether they're towns or cities, north or south, to have lots of opportunities for people to have decent work and decent pay and a decent lifestyle. But in order to do that, you've got to trust local people. You've got to trust local businesses. You've got to trust local workers. You've got to trust local unions to deliver that in the interests of local people. And under this government, we've seen increasing centralisation, not just in Whitehall, but in Downing Street. Whitehall departments aren't even being empowered to do their job right now, unless number 10 and number 11 have signed it off. That is not going to deliver jobs for people across the country. And the last point I'd make is just about building an inclusive society. If you're building back better, an economic strategy based on inclusion is an economic strategy based on growth. Whether it's about paying key workers properly, whether it's thinking about the power balance and the distribution of wealth, especially in the technological revolution. And at the heart of all of that, and I'm very disappointed to see this from the government, is needing trade union voices and worker voices around the table. The government started at the beginning of the pandemic to talk to trade unions, but now it's stopped and it's not doing it, and it's completely unacceptable. And on my committee, as Sue said, I chair the House of Commons Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee. We've given a platform to trade union voices, and we will continue to do so, even if the government doesn't, because we know that the Tories really, when it comes to it, are not going to be delivering for working people, and only a Labour government will do that. And we will be holding them to account every single day and making our case to the British people in the run-up to the next election why only Labour can deliver in their interests and why we need a Labour government in 2024. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Darren. It's really important work that you're doing on the Select Committee. And it's so good to hear you talk about the importance of investment in people and skills alongside investment in infrastructure. I'm going to turn now to Miatta and get Nev's take on building back better. Miatta has been at the forefront of generating new ideas on reshaping the economy, both from within government and outside of it. Before joining the New Economics Foundation, she was political advisor to the leader of the opposition. And before that, she spent 8 years working in senior roles in the Cabinet Office, so within government. So Miatta, over to you. Please give us your take on building back better.
Thank you, Sue. Absolutely delighted to be joining everyone this afternoon. I think for me, the thing that's really interesting is that what was and is a public health crisis, first and foremost, is being accompanied by an unprecedented economic crisis. And the early warning signs are pretty dire. So last week, the Office for Budget Responsibility came out and said that it's projecting a 12% shrinking of the economy this year. This is the biggest contraction we've seen for about 300 years. Its projections on unemployment are even more severe than they were a few months ago. So it's now projecting about 3 million unemployed this year, 3.5 million next year. So these are unprecedented levels. We haven't seen anything like this since the 1980s. And I think we should be in no doubt that we are entering a really turbulent period economically. And, the economic crisis that we are in the midst will be absolutely profound. But I think it's a crisis that's shining a spotlight on deep-seated, long-standing structural problems we've had in the economy. Like the fact that living standards have pretty much stagnated since 2008 as wages have failed to budge despite growth. I think it's shining a spotlight on the fact that, you know, workers that are doing valuable work that is absolutely critical to our day-to-day existence as a society have not been valued enough and have been paid low pay and have insecure work. I think it's shining a spotlight on how denuded our social security system has become, whether that's through underinvestment in vital public services like health or social care, or the absolute inadequacy of our benefits and social security system. And then finally, I think it's shining a spotlight on the cost and the untold suffering of not preparing and not responding to these sorts of natural crises, despite the warnings of scientists. And I think the thing that struck me is how quickly this is crystallized in the public mood and how quickly the debate is shifting. The vulnerabilities that have been exposed, I think, are already forging a consensus for change. And some of the polling that we've done has shown that actually overwhelmingly, the public does not want to return back to business as usual. You know, 6% want to go back to the old normal, which is absolutely astounding. And I think across the political spectrum, this sentiment is being played back, it's being reflected. You know, the Prime Minister came out and said that he wanted to build back better through a New Deal. Now, I don't know how much of that is rhetoric and how much of that is reality, but what I do know is that he is having to reflect the sentiment in the country. He's having to reflect what people feel and want. And I think so that creates the opportunity, the political space to forge a new consensus on the need to build a fairer, a more equal, a more sustainable economy coming out of this. And the fact that the government is having to tear up the old rule books, it's having to tear up, you know, the way that we used to do things, the mainstream, in order to respond to this crisis, I think is challenging the mainstream and is making ideas that felt too risky or too radical suddenly acceptable. So, you know, this opportunity to not just, I think, forge a new consensus that goes across politics, but the adoption of radical policies in order to deliver the change that people want, I think is a really rare and important one. But I think it's a fragile one. And my biggest fear is that we don't lock in this sentiment. We don't lock in the mood in the country and translate it into meaningful change. And the moment passes and other priorities take over and we're in another moment. And that lots of voices, and there are many, you know, we managed to get 350 organizations from across civil society, trade unions, business, all saying they wanted to build back better. But our fear is that if we do this in a fragmented way, that means that we are not greater than the sum of our parts, and we fail to create a drumbeat that puts pressure for change, we won't see the change that we all want. So it's clear to me that the nature and indeed the scale of the change that is required will cause a broad coalition of voices, from national organizations with their reach and influence to the trade union movement to grassroots organizations coming together to win this change. And, you know, collectively saying, if you are serious about building that better, Prime Minister, if you are serious, that means a new social settlement that seeks to enshrine protections for everyone through a proper social security system that doesn't leave people on the breadline, through well-funded public services, social care, health, as well as quality housing. It means taking proper radical action to try and tackle inequality between people and places. And that also means trying to create good, well-paid, decent, secure work for people. And it means actually, you know, union power, stronger worker power, and thinking about new, creative, innovative mechanism in which we deal with the fact that wages are below where they need to be, and we need to see a massive increase in wages over the course of the next 5 years. And then finally, it means doing whatever it takes to respond and prepare in a way that we didn't for this pandemic, for the bigger crisis which is already upon us of climate change. But I think to galvanize people around this, we don't just need a narrative that captures the public mood and resonates across political boundaries. We need bold, common sense ideas that people can rally around. And then we need a powerful coalition, a powerful movement to push for these as demands and build political pressure that it will be hard for any politician, no matter where they are in the political spectrum, to ignore. And if we can pull this off, we have a chance of winning the sort of profound change which would right the wrongs of an economy that quite frankly just does not work for everyone. and create a new economic and social settlement coming out of this horrific pandemic. Now, I don't pretend for a second that this isn't hard. Getting a broad movement to coalesce and work in a collective way to win change is hard. Trying to cut across natural political divides and biases to forge a new consensus is hard. Trying to shift ingrained ways of doing things and rewrite the rule books is hard. But if not now, then when? If not in response to the biggest crisis we have seen for 300 years, then when? And moments like this, they come once in a few generations. And so we have to do everything that we can collectively to win back better, to force our politics to respond to this moment. And if we manage this, then perhaps some light comes out of the darkness of this awful pandemic. Thank you.
Miata, thank you very much. I think you raise a really interesting question about, can we use this as an opportunity to respond effectively and sustainably to the climate crisis? And I wonder how optimistic or pessimistic other panelists feel about that. So we maybe come back to that in the Q&A. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Joanne Nisbet. Joanne is director of Gap Square, and Gap Square is an organisation that uses data and analysis to forecast for the future. Very much, I think, Joanne, with a view to fair and diverse workforce solutions and making sure that we can use all of the talent available to build a better future. So over to you, Joanne.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you. Yes, and thank you very much for having me today. As you introduced, yes, I'm director of Gap Square and very passionate about being able to create a fair and inclusive culture in a workplace and have that workforce around us. I've also got a second hat. I work in business as well as an HR director, and again, those two roles and two angles have such a lot of synergy and meaning right now. With the pandemic and the impacts on business, and it was really interesting to hear both Darren and Miata to speaking, because I think some of the words and phrases you use are really resonating with me right now in what I'm experiencing. That fair and inclusive society, you know, I think really plays out, and businesses have a key role to play in enabling everyone in society to have a role and contribute. So yes, what am I seeing? How optimistic? I am optimistic, and I think that juxtaposition that you articulated incredibly well, Miata, just now, of, you know, we've got some huge challenges, but we've also got some massive opportunities. And I think what I'm seeing is the ability for us to use data and technology to not only track what's happened in the past, but to help us look at what's coming in the future in a way that I have never seen before. And I'm also seeing creative minds and some of the things I've been hearing in the last couple of months in business meetings, be that in the Gap Square environment or in my HR director's role, is how can we make the most of this situation? How can we use this as an opportunity to drive that change? You know, people are open and want change, and you know, we've been running many surveys with our workforces that show exactly that. I think we had 10% of people were wanting to come back into the workplace, and if they had more choice, it may even be less than that. Is some of the data that we've been finding. So yes, people are hungry for change, but alongside that, the speed at which decisions are having to be made right now in the corporate world is unprecedented, and I've seen big decisions taking that businesses are having to take about its workforce, about how it supports and protects its workforce, and making difficult decisions without knowing what the future holds, and that's been a real challenge, I think, in the business environment. And certainly I'm keen for us to learn from that and to say, well, what data can we use? What tech have we got available to us? We've all embraced tech in a way that I don't think any of us would have predicted 6 months ago. How can we really use that to help us shape some data-based decisions about the future in a world that's so uncertain? So for me, I think we've got real opportunities to help include people and build build a more equal workforce. But I think some of the challenges that we can see coming down the road, that we are going to have to make some big decisions on how is this going to affect our culture and how people feel involved in an organisation and part of it and included and supported. Those are some real challenges that we're facing, alongside, well, actually there's some really commercial opportunities here. You know, do we need all of the size of premises that we've got? I know a lot of businesses are starting to think along those lines, and how a more flexible workforce gives opportunities to create more broad spaces that appeal to people in different ways, but also maybe to look at some financial benefits from changing the workplaces around and enabling people to work from home. You know, salaries are often driven by location, and if location is no longer an issue, there's some real commercial challenges that I'm seeing come through. And I think that the ability to embrace data and to involve people in our decisions as a business. One of the pieces of work that I'm working on with a business right now is looking at the strategy and saying, well, we were going in that direction. Of all of those aspects, which bits do we need to retain that aren't really affected at the moment, and they're still really core part and important principle that our business needs to hold on to? Are there any aspects that we need to remove as a business, things that we shouldn't be doing anymore? And actually that opportunity to embrace that and look at some of those decisions in a way that we may not have felt possible before. Are there things that we can recalibrate, do slightly differently, and that we need to rethink and change the way we do them? And are there things that we can reinvent? I think that I've heard many times recently that the you know, curiosity, creativity, innovation, and I think that opportunity to let people around you contribute, listen to them, listen to their ideas. I think we've just got a real unprecedented opportunity now to really reshape the way we operate businesses, and that we support our people. But what I'm hearing most, and as both an HR director and as a director in GapSquare, is the fierce protection that businesses are having over retaining as many of their people as possible, and supporting them through this pandemic. You know, mental health support, supporting people's well-being, being very aware that people aren't physically together in the office, and finding creative and new ways to support people. And I think that human side of business that I've certainly seen in the last few months has had a real impact on me, and I've seen people who perhaps in ordinary day-to-day lives, I sort of saw them as, you know, of course they would always want to be somebody that came into the office and worked in a very traditional way. And I've seen real change and open-mindedness in the last few months. And I think for me, if we can encourage that and nurture that, and find ways to really embrace it, then I think businesses will find themselves able to not only ride this current environment, but to come out stronger and better. So for me, listening to your people, involving them, respecting them, enabling them to be creative and curious, I think is what businesses can do, but making those decisions, and often fast decisions, underpinned by data, and that curious mind to ask questions that we perhaps hadn't necessarily asked before. So for me, I absolutely see that juxtaposition, but I'm really optimistic about the future, and I've heard and seen some fabulous stories of people, you know, really being resolved to make sure we do make the best of this and learn everything we can from the lockdown and this pandemic to take us forward into a new world.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Listening to you, it made me sort of reflect that it's just like Building Back Better has loads of interpretations. We hear a lot from employers now about the new normal, which means different things to different people, and causes some anxiety as well, because just as you said, there are lots of opportunities for more flexible working, but also lots of people who can't work at home and don't have the circumstances that's good for them to work at home. So lots to think about there. Now, last but not least, we come to Wes Streeting MP. Wes is MP for Ilford North, and he's also Shadow Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, responsible for UK growth and productivity, R&D policy, energy and green infrastructure. So actually right in the middle of this debate, and I guess whatever else it's about, it's also always about the money. So over to you.
Yeah, that's right. So thank you, Sue, and it's great to be virtually with you at Tolpuddle. As Darren said at the beginning, I really wish that we were out in the sunshine in Dorset, but hopefully next year. I was just, as I was listening to other speakers, I was trying to think about this question of optimism and how optimistic do we feel? I mean, on one hand, we've got a Conservative Chancellor doing things that we never would imagine a Conservative Chancellor do in a million years. When the job retention scheme was set up, in no small part thanks to not just the pressure, but the active involvement of trade unions helping to design that scheme, I think lots of us were impressed. We never imagined that when we called for the Conservatives to pay people's wages and keep people in jobs that they would actually do it. We knew it would make a difference. We had to, I think it's fair to say, drag them to doing something for the self-employed as well through the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. But at the start of the crisis, there was a sense that the scale of this was understood and that the response would measure up to the scale of the challenge. But as the passage of time has gone on, I'm becoming less and less convinced that when the Chancellor says he wants to pursue an approach which is, as he describes it, unencumbered by dogma, that he really means it. And it's been interesting in the House of Commons in recent weeks that there are more and more Conservative backbenchers who are vocalising their level of unease because clearly they're not ready to drop their small state, low tax for the wealthy, unfettered free market dogma, which has left this country pre-crisis with a decade of loss for our economy. You know, we've had a decade of slow growth, low productivity, people's wages not keeping up with the cost of living. This has not been a great decade for our country, and actually going into this crisis, we were less prepared than we might otherwise have been for the scale of the public health consequences. And, you know, in terms of thinking about how we build better, we should ask how it was that we ever as a country allowed so many people to be dangerously exposed to this deadly virus, because we'd failed to deal with the crisis in social care, which has been talked about and debated for more than a decade, and yet so little has been done. We should ask why it was that the government had to spend huge sums building new hospital facilities from scratch because they failed to properly invest in the NHS for over a decade. And frankly, I think there are lots of people in the country who should be asking why it was that for so many years, not just sections of the media, but sections of the public at large have been calling for more and more cuts to the welfare system, so that going into this crisis with a level of unemployment that we haven't seen in this country for decades, people are now staring into the grim reality of a social insecurity system where, you know, if they find themselves out of work or working on fewer hours, they're not able to make ends meet and provide the basics, the roof over their head, money in the electricity meter, food on the table. And we should also ask how it was, by the way, that we went into this crisis with so many people in work, working all the hours God sends, working more than a normal working week in some cases, and still unable to pay for those basics, because we haven't dealt with, you know, so many of our social problems, the cost of housing, the cost of living, chronic endemic low pay. The fact that, you know, it's what, July, we're more than halfway through the year, and there hasn't been a single prosecution this year from HMRC for employers failing to pay the national minimum wage. And I've failed to believe that there are employers out there who are, you know, who aren't paying the minimum wage. So I think there are so many problems underlying our economy, as Miata said, before we even think about the consequences of this crisis. And it is going to be pretty bad, to put it mildly. We are now facing a degree of structural unemployment in this country that we haven't seen since the 80s. And if some of the projections come to pass, it will actually be even worse. For young people, we know that will be particularly bad. And for them and for the communities in which they live, we've seen in previous recessions the long-term scarring effects of successive recessions. So when the Prime Minister says he wants to build back better, borrowing from some of the language that's been used by campaigning organisations, by Labour politicians like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham. When he says he wants to build back greener, when he says he wants to focus on jobs, 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 I mean, literally copying and pasting from Labour's script, there isn't much evidence at the moment that he genuinely means it. I mean, let's just take climate change as an example, something I'm very passionate about. There are ways, there are policy responses that can do three really important immediate things. They can help keep people in work by, home insulation, for example, provides the kind of jobs that people who are losing theirs right now could move straight into, either retrofitting people's homes or going door to door and selling home improvements. That would have the benefit of creating jobs, bringing down the cost of people's energy and helping us move further towards meeting our climate change objectives. And yet what the government announced just last week, a £2 billion investment, is less than the 9 billion they promised in their manifesto, which even then wasn't good enough as far as the Committee on Climate Change is concerned. And when the government boasts that we're making more progress than most other advanced economies in tackling climate change, I mean, at least that's got the virtue of being true, which isn't always the case for what Boris Johnson says, but that's not a reflection of Conservative success. It's a reflection of international failure to take the steps we need to tackle climate change, because unless we make the bulk of the progress that we need to make in this decade, between 2020 and 2030, not the next 3 decades to 2050, the next decade is where it counts. Future generations are going to be cursing ours and saying, how was it that they knew what was coming, they knew what needed to be done and they failed to act, and they squandered the opportunity and left our planet with irreversible catastrophic climate breakdown. I mean, this is kind of really big existential stuff. I think the challenge for all of us, I mean, it's a particular challenge for politicians, particularly those who want to win elections so we can do something about it rather than just talk about it. But it's a shared challenge, I think, across the Labour movement and people who genuinely want to see a better country built in the aftermath of this crisis. People don't talk about broken economic models in their daily lives. They don't talk about the need for a paradigm shift or a different model of capitalism. But they do see the consequences of our broken economic model in their everyday lives. They see it when their wages don't pay for the cost of living. They see it when their public services weren't as good as they used to be. And they see it reflected in the societies in which we live through increased rough sleeping and when they fall on hard times, the reality of a social security system that isn't worthy of the name. So we've got to make sure in terms of our politics and our demands that we're always connecting with the everyday reality of people's lived experiences and providing really practical answers that give people hope that there are answers to those challenges and it doesn't all seem far too big and far too scary or far too complicated. And I'm convinced that we can do that. We suffered a terrible election defeat back in December and in the aftermath, I was left feeling that this is a decade challenge to get Labour back to power. We can't wait. The country can't wait. We've got to work together, pull together as a movement to make sure that we're keeping this government on its toes, holding them to account, making the best government they can possibly be, but also making sure we've got an alternative and change that people can believe in so that we've got a Labour government again delivering for working people up and down the country, because that is the only way I think ultimately we're going to be able to build back better, build back greener and build a better future for people in every part of our country.
Wes, thanks very much. So thanks to the discipline of our panellists, we've got a good 20 minutes or so for Q&A and we've got some very good questions that have come up. I can't promise that we'll get through them all, but we'll see how far we get. Now, the first question is from Nicholas Patience, and I think it touches on the fact that actually one of the lessons we've learned through this public health crisis is that regulation isn't red tape, regulation is a public good. And Nicholas is asking specifically about the HSE. Let me declare an interest as a senior official in Prospect. We represent the staff in HSE. And so I have views about this and the union has views. But Nicholas's question is, what are your views, panellists, on the recent initiative by government to get HSE to carry out COVID visits, giving them 14 million in funding to do that, and HSE asking ex-inspectors to go back to work temporarily to be able to do it? So I can see both Darren and Wes nodding. So which one of you would like to have first go at that?
I went first last time, so let Wes go first this time.
Wes.
Thanks, Darren. In fact, I just raised this in Parliament on Thursday because, well, I tell you, it was extraordinary, actually. Even by the standards of answers from ministers, this was a different level as far as I'm concerned. In Leicester, with a local lockdown that they're experiencing and the sorts of factory conditions that were a big part of how the virus erupted again and led to that city being locked down. I think we should be asking really serious questions about what's happened at the HSE over the last decade. And so I did. I said to Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, whether in light of what happened in Leicester, he regretted the fact that the government had cut HSE's budget by 48% and had instructed the HSE to reduce inspections in textiles by a third. He didn't, not only did he not know or recognise the figures and had no idea that the Health and Safety Executive had been cut that far on his watch while he's been a Conservative MP voting for the cuts. He then had the audacity to turn around and blame local councils, clearly unaware that local councils aren't responsible for going in to inspect textiles factories. I mean, there are things that local councils can and should be doing, and probably be doing a lot more if they hadn't had their budget slashed over the last decade. But I just thought this was the height of negligence from the politician who is responsible for health in our country, that he just didn't understand. And even after what happened in Leicester, hadn't even bothered to ask why it was that the Health and Safety Executive hadn't picked up. And, the government is asking more and more people to go back to work and to return to their workplaces. This is a time when we really need the HSE to be able to work with employers, to go into workplaces and to make sure that it is safe for people. And the person responsible for health in our country in the middle of a pandemic clearly doesn't understand the basics and the basic connection between the public health crisis he's dealing with on one hand and workplace safety on the other. And of course, over the last decade, these cuts would have been cheered as the question alluded to and Sue said, cuts to red tape and bureaucracy. This isn't red tape, it isn't bureaucracy. It is the difference between people being safe and well or even alive in their workplaces or not. And I think it's a damning indictment on the government that we're in this place. I also think it's a damning indictment that even when trade union leaders offered to send in workplace reps, train workplace reps to help employers open up, the government didn't take that offer seriously. Len McCluskey made the offer directly, and it's not like Len struggles to get his voice heard. And the government didn't listen. I just think it's negligent. I think it's irresponsible. And I think, again, this comes back to some of the really big questions we need to ask ourselves as a country coming out of this crisis, about our priorities and about, swallowing some of this rhetoric from the right in terms of health and safety and red tape and bureaucracy, because this is where it gets us.
Thanks, Wes. Darren, do you want to comment on this?
I'll just add two minor points. I mean, obviously, I agree with everything Wes has just said, but it isn't just about the Health and Safety Executive, is my kind of broader point. If we had workplaces that had trade union officials in them and employers that didn't block trade union organising in their workplaces, and I have some of these, household brands in my constituency where trade unions aren't allowed in or even kind of recognised in the workplace, then of course these issues would be picked up much earlier on and be dealt with because of collective organising in the workplace. So there's kind of a structural problem on that side, but also the cuts in funding to public health services and Public Health England and our public health directors in local authorities has also meant that we've got very, very small teams with very, very large remits who, by the way, have been working literally 7 days a week since this pandemic has kicked off, and we should pay special tribute to them for their hard work. And so it goes to this broader point that you mentioned at the beginning, Sue, in that red tape is seen as a negative kind of connotation of what is essentially a public framework in which risks are managed, but you can only manage risks if you've got people in jobs and in roles whose job it is to understand and identify those. And if you don't let unions organise and you cut Public Health England and you also cut the Health and Safety Executive, then of course you're going to end up in these situations where you don't have the capacity to respond when you need to.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to come next to Joanne Kay from Bristol, who says, this is the second Zoom meeting where no women have asked questions. Joanne, the good news is some women have asked questions after you, but the question you ask is really valid. And it is, so how can economic recovery support women as workers and also ensure childcare is treated as infrastructure? Miatta, can I come first to you on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. A really important question because the economic crisis is going to impact everyone, but we know it's going to impact some groups more than others. We know it's going to impact young people. We know it's going to impact people on lower wages, and we know it's going to impact women. And I think there's a big risk that women who are having to sort of step out of the labour market because of childcare struggle to come back. And so for me, thinking about, and this comes back to the point that one of the things the government has to do is think about how it tailors its intervention. And childcare is an easy win for me. You know, the childcare system was in crisis before the pandemic. It was already on its knees. We have a strange kind of privatized system that doesn't really work. Carers who are doing the most vital work, right? We know that early years intervention and education is profound for life chances of kids. And yet we have carers that are paid terribly. We have awful kind of job retention. So the system was already broken. And the pandemic is making that worse. And actually parents either having to or opting to keep their kids out of childcare settings means that a lot of providers are worried they're about to go bankrupt. So I think the government's going to have to bail out. At the moment, it's been really resistant to try and intervene in childcare. And the thing that we are saying is, you know, we're all about infrastructure spending. Well, their social infrastructure is just as important as the hard kit. It's just as important as the bricks and mortar. And the benefits of investing in social infrastructure, we know it is absolutely critical, both for growth, but also for the resilience of our society. And so one of the things that we think the government's going to have to do, and we're calling for a kind of childcare infrastructure fund, and we use the language of infrastructure on purpose, is to try and pump money so that childcare providers can cover the cost of both their staff, but also their overheads. And in return, we are saying they should be providing childcare for free, which we hope starts to tip us closer to the sort of universal childcare system that we see, for example, in Scandinavia. And in the end, I think is the sort of system that we have to get to if we're serious about high quality childcare that allows parents into the labour market.
Thanks, Miatta. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question, which, Joanne, it's directed at you initially. Others may wish to comment. And it's picking up on your points about workers being treated fairly. But the questioner, who is Richard, is saying, well, workers aren't being treated fairly. They're being made to pay by businesses for the crisis. And he specifically cites workers at Heathrow Airport who've been told they could be dismissed if they don't accept voluntary pay cuts. And I think we've seen further stories, including British Airways seeking to do this in the media today. And it is the reality for too many workers. So, Joanne, initially, others who may want to comment, do you agree that it's only trade union action that can actually protect jobs in those circumstances?
Well, it's a really good question, and absolutely that, you know, that there are some terrible stories of you know, complete industries and sectors that you know, are really struggling and will continue to for some time, and that inevitably jobs will be lost as a result of this. And I think, you know, we can't get around that. What I think is important, I think there's two things: there's the what and there's the how. And of course, you know, we've heard already lots of debate around what the government are doing to try and support businesses, and you know, it's clear that not every business is going to be able to be supported, so that it doesn't need to lose people. But the more the economy can do to protect jobs, absolutely, that's key. So minimising the what as far as we can in sort of UK PLC is clearly important. But then there's the how, and certainly from my perspective, how businesses go about doing this, I think is really important, because in the future, if they are to remain an employer, how they treat people in really tough times, I think goes an awfully long way for their longer term reputation. And so whilst I think that the unions absolutely have a role, because I think it's important for the workers, the employees, to be able to speak up, and if on an individual basis that's not easy and possible to do, particularly in large businesses, then obviously there is a key role to play by the unions to enable that voice to be heard. So I think there is a responsibility on people to speak up and give suggestions, ideas. I talked earlier about creativity and innovation. You know, I think people who have got a lot of experience in their sector have a perspective and can share that in this challenge or problem of looking at you know, needing to perhaps reduce roles or change the way business is done in certain sectors. And then I think there's a real responsibility on the employer to listen, to ask their people, you know, we've got this problem, we need to do something to fix it. How can we work with you to ensure we do it in a way that is as respectful as possible, as inclusive as possible, and as fair as possible. You know, treating people with respect and fairness. I think if there's a difficult outcome at the end of it, that may not always be able to be avoided, but it's done in a way that is respectful of people and their circumstances. So I think the other obligation on organisations and businesses that are challenged in this way is to really look creatively, and we saw some of these examples earlier on in the pandemic, where whole sectors of the aviation industry were focusing on, well, I can't work here, but maybe I can help, you know, in the Nightingale Hospital, for example. And I think that creative thought process, and I think there is an obligation on organisations to be creative and to support people who may not be able to continue working for them. But, you know, we talked earlier about the fact that we've got these fantastic tools available to us at the moment. It's very cheap and easy to put on a webinar or a seminar like this, you know, over a Zoom call, for example. Why not use that tech to help our people if we're having to ask them to change the way they do things, or indeed look for alternative work? What role can we play in doing that? So I think for me there's a sense of shared responsibility. You know, this is a problem that we've all been faced with, and the more respectfully we can deal with it, the more we can listen to people and take creative ideas forward. I think we as a population will handle it in a more robust way that sets people off for the future in the best way possible. But yeah, we can't get away from the fact that, you know, some organisations are having to make some really difficult decisions, and I think it's really important that people are enabled to have their say in that.
Thanks, Joanne. Actually, I'm going to move on. I'm going to roll two questions together, and these are questions about what the future might look like. So Alexa Phillips is asking, what kind of specific policies can prevent mass unemployment, and how do we pay for them without a return to austerity? Or should we accept that many jobs will be lost and invest in the creation of new jobs, for example, green construction jobs and mitigation strategies such as universal basic income? And in a similar vein, Chris Jones asks, is the Labour Party preparing an alternative vision of what it wants to be done around which to positively campaign? And specifically, does that include re-resourcing local government? Darren, can I come first to you on those?
Yeah, of course, although I should put down the disclaimer, I'm merely a humble backbencher, so I'll let Wes answer the question from the front bench about what the Labour Party's kind of policy development is from that perspective. I mean, in terms of I touched a little bit about on this in my opening remarks, which is, you know, there will be changes in workplaces and businesses. And I think the one thing that we need to be conscious of is that the biggest employer in the country is the SME sector, and it accounts for about 99% of jobs across the British economy. And SMEs often, in my view, get overlooked in terms of kind of the big policy announcements from government, and they're much less resilient than big businesses because there's less of them, they've got less cash flow, they've got less kind of things to be able to pull in to help give them stability when you're in the middle of a recession. And so that's one reason I've been calling for additional support from government for SMEs, but also to try to find mechanisms where, you know, the big household name companies are also able to share some of the benefit that they're getting with their supply chains to try to keep that resilience in the workplace. And that's just one example of what I referred to as the kind of stabilizers. And that's the really important role for the state. You know, this is a state-sponsored economic recovery in a way like never before, and that should come with conditionality for businesses, both in terms of creating new roles. So thinking about, you know, if you're in the aerospace sector and you want to create the wings of the future and you want to create lighter materials, or think about kind of cleaner flights, you know, priming that investment now and making sure that workers are transitioning into those jobs now, so that when that market becomes more available in the future commercially, you're kind of ready to take off, excuse the pun, that wasn't intended, into that kind of sector of the economy. Also, again, on supply chains, we know that productivity is a real problem because lots of businesses haven't been able to digitize or improve their processes using technology. Big businesses are very good at this. Why can't we make tweaks to the apprenticeship levy to allow big businesses to spend that and put the people who have done that in their organizations into their supply chain to help their suppliers and partners to also go through that transformation? Again, creating new types of jobs and new types of workplaces. So there's things you can put into that around conditionality that that can really, I think, work for people. And Wes has already talked about the low-hanging fruit from obvious policy decisions like energy efficiency funding and how that creates jobs for people in every single part of the country, as well as transitioning onto net zero, which is important. And just very, very briefly on the last question, because it's related to this question, I've long been talking about the new relationship between the state and business. And businesses are talking about that now. I mean, as chair of the business committee, I've been on webinars with the British Academy, with the Financial Times, with the Institute of Directors, and they're all talking about the future of the corporation and the way in which businesses have to manage this new relationship with the state so that it works in all of our interests. And where businesses are acting in good faith, that should be encouraged, and we should collaborate on that and understand where public funding and private funding can kind of get the outcomes that we need. But ultimately, when businesses are acting in bad faith, and I think BA is an example of this, there does need to be enforcement. You know, there needs to be a stick as well as a carrot for this transition. And we've seen, you know, Keir Starmer raised this in Prime Minister's questions last week, and the government basically just ignored the question. If the government doesn't attach conditionality to support for companies that make sure that their kind of approach to workers is inclusive and fair and just, then some businesses aren't going to do that. And again, that then comes down to the question of trade union power, because if individual workers haven't got the power and the state's not willing to do anything and the business can get away with it, you do need that collective organizing. And so you can start to see how through public policy, you pin all of these pieces together and you start to have a kind of framework in which you can help workers in parts of the country have more power, more say, more opportunities for skills and development, more opportunity to transition into new work in their local communities. And I just think that's, I hope I'm not being naive, but that seems perfectly achievable to me. And it's very distressing, and hence Wes's point about better for us being in government than in opposition, to keep raising these points, these credible points to the government, and they just kind of ignore you. But anyway, I'll let Wes talk about the official Labour Party stuff, because he's better qualified than I am at that.
Before we get there, and just conscious of time and wanting to get another question in, so Miatta and Wes, just hold that in your heads, but let me add this dimension from Sheila, who's from the NEU in Bristol, who says, does Building Back Better to trade union event need to focus on ensuring paying conditions are improved, that people who are given places to stay so they weren't on the streets are assured to have ongoing good accommodation, and that free school meals are available through holidays to prevent holiday hunger, or even more, that wages and benefits mean that all can afford food and housing. I think it shouldn't be too much to aim for or to hope for. Miatta.
Yeah, no, great set of questions. So, you know, the projections tell us we're headed towards mass unemployment, but I don't think it's inevitable. And I think the right mix of policy response can definitely mitigate some of this. I think some of the frustration with the government is that they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. And it's almost like they don't quite believe that the numbers are going to play out in the way that the numbers are going to play out unless they act. And for us, there are sort of three things that need to happen. I think the furlough scheme was the right innovation. It was driven by lots of people pushing out the idea that you essentially needed to subsidize wages. And the reality of why it was put in place a few months ago hasn't gone away for certain sectors. And where sectors are constrained because of social distancing, where sectors are constrained because they're still locked down, it is absolutely madness that the government would look to move away from the furlough scheme. It doesn't make any sense to me. Take a sectoral approach and support the industries that you need to, but you've got to then align that with actually thinking about ways in which you help people retrain where you think actually the long-term prospect is looking difficult for that sector, and try to think about how you place them. So I think that's the first thing, and I completely agree with Darren. We are essentially bailing out huge parts of the economy, and we're not attaching conditions. The very basic, simple condition is you look after your worker. The state supports you, that's us, the taxpayer, by the way, supporting you. You look after us as a consequence. And why we're not doing that, it is so easy, it's such a no-brainer, is kind of beyond me. I think the second piece is because there will be sectors that will have to shed jobs. We create jobs, and lots of them, and the state has a huge role to play in this. You know, Wes talked about the opportunities around the green economy. They're massive. You know, our analysis suggested that rather than the government's 3 billion, if it had pumped in 28.3 billion into energy efficiency, insulation, retrofitting, we would be talking about 400,000 jobs that we could create in the next 18 months. We know we've got 122,000 job shortages in social care, 100,000 in healthcare. If they put in 5 billion into social care, that's 180,000 jobs that they're creating. So the state can invest in public services in the Korean economy to create jobs, and it's then got to align that with mechanisms to retrain people and place them into these jobs. And then the final piece is, you know, for those, even if it's for a short-term period, that fall into unemployment, we've got to beef up the social security system. It is an absolute scandal. Universal credit at 90 quid a week is an absolute disgrace. Our social security system is the weakest across all the OECD countries. It's the lowest it's been since it was created after the Second World War. So, you know, our view, we talk about a minimum income guarantee. That's £220 a week that is available straight away for anyone that needs it, and ensures that they can afford food, to your final question, and they can ensure that they have the basics they need to live. That is not beyond the wits of us as a society and of our government to deliver. And if they can do that package of things, we have a chance of mitigating mass unemployment. If they fudge it, if they muddle it, if they delay, they dither, they don't do, we're headed towards mass unemployment.
Thanks, Miatta. Now, Wes, this is really unfair because you've got about 90 seconds to cover a whole range of big issues. But
because I agree so much with what Darren and Miatta have just said, so I won't duplicate those points, except to say, you know, it is frustrating when Miatta talked about some of the sums involved, for example, in solving the social care workforce challenge. The government has just spent pretty much that amount of money on the job retention bonus, which was described as a deadweight cost by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And we're already seeing employers like John Lewis saying, oh, we don't want that actually, we're just going to make our staff redundant. So the failure is there. There is much more that can be done on a sectoral basis to prevent unemployment. That's why we've called for sector by sector arrangements. You'll be pleased to know we are absolutely looking at you know, our alternatives in terms of re-resourcing local government. Of course, we should be improving paying conditions and making sure that children in our country in this century do not go hungry. And I think with Building Back Greener, there is a real opportunity here. If we can show people that tackling climate change also creates jobs and opportunities and improvements to quality of life, we will build the public support we need to do even more of the policies that we desperately need to prevent catastrophic climate breakdown.
thanks ever so much. We are pretty much out of time, so thank you all of the panelists. I think it's been a great discussion. For those of you who are tuned in, this has been recorded. It should be up on YouTube on Monday, should you want to listen to any of it again. Enjoy the rest of the festival, and thank you all for your participation.